Hey folks, hot enough for you? I love that somebody tried to say hello from their town in this stream and said hell from wherever it is. Um, and we are, wait, there's a Snake River, Wichita, Kansas. No, it's going too fast. Chandler, Arizona, it's not chilly there, right? And here's Facebook coming in from Utah. Danny, I can't see when you come in. There's Nancy. So I hope you're here. And Kansas, I have a friend from that town in Kansas. He now lives in Norway, Anchorage, Alaska, North Carolina. Anyway, welcome everybody here. And I hope you're doing what you can to stay cool. Remember, if you get too hot, I can't believe I'm telling you all this. You probably know it, but putting your feet in a bucket of cold water helps cool your whole body down if you don't have AC, which obviously we don't. Anyway, I looked at your questions and I think I can walk you through some of what's going on right now. But a number of you did say you wanted to know what I'm thinking about. And I'm going to start there today because I'm thinking a lot about the larger picture of American politics right now and the larger picture of American history. And one of the things that really jumps out to me for all of American politics is I think a lot of how we got to where we are is through something that I've been calling dominance politics or cowboy individualism. And what I mean by that is that if you think about the period after World War II, when pretty much everybody, Republicans, independents, Democrats, all believed in what they called the liberal consensus. And that's the concept of liberalism is the idea that the government should protect the rights and liberties of the individual. And in the United States, in the 19th century, until the 19th century, that meant that the government should stay small so that it didn't tax people a lot, for example, or order them around. But that switches at the turn into the 20th century when people like Theodore Roosevelt recognize that the government needs to be big enough to make sure that individuals still can, achieve everything that they want to achieve, despite the extraordinary power of massive industries that are, paying pennies for an hour of work and mangling people's arms and hurting people and polluting the environment. So after World War II, members of all the parties believed in that idea of a liberal consensus. And the consensus was that the government had a role to play in regulating business. So in fact, it protected individuals and that there were laws protecting people's safety on shop floors and that they couldn't just pour their crap into the city streets and that they couldn't pollute and they couldn't pollute the air and the water and so on. So that people believed that the government should regulate business. They should provide a basic social safety net so that if you were disabled or elderly or your parents had died, that the government would make sure that you actually could get an education and have a place to live and to eat. They believed in promoting infrastructure because they recognized that there were a lot of infrastructure programs that were not the kind of things that would pay off for companies to do. So it was worth the government putting down roads, for example, and putting in telephone lines and telegraph lines and making sure that people had access, everybody in America had access to the same kinds of infrastructure, because that's not just amenities. As you know, without, for example, nowadays access to a telephone, it's really difficult to conduct business the same way everybody else does. I actually live in a place where I don't have cell service. And in order for me to make a phone call, I have to get to a cell tower. And it works for me because that's the life I have chosen to live. But it is, it makes my life a lot harder. If you can just pick up a phone and make a phone call, I can't do that. And in the, after World War II, they recognized that people needed indoor plumbing and they needed access to electricity and things like that. So the government people believe that the government should promote infrastructure, and they also believe that the government should promote civil rights. And by that, they meant that people should be treated equally before the law, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, or their religion, or their ability. That's what people believed with this liberal consensus. And it was very, very widely shared. And I would argue it still is widely shared. But in order to push back against that, the radical right began to argue for the concept that all the government should do is to, stop protecting all those things because that intruded on an individual's life, and that was crushing the individual rather than enabling that person to flower and become whatever that person wanted to be. And the symbol that they used was the American cowboy. And what they argued was that that was a true American, the idea of an American who did everything on his own, which was complete crap, by the way. The cowboys, by the way, a third of the cowboys were people of color, and they depended on the U.S. government. But the image was that the cowboy did everything on his own and didn't need the government for anything. And the government intruding in those four areas I just talked about cost tax dollars, and men couldn't run their businesses the way that they wanted to. So they begin to focus on this idea of the American cowboy who doesn't really, he protects his women. He's good with a gun. He asserts his power by through hard work and through violence over people of color and over women. And he doesn't need anything from the government. And that's what that argument was in the 1950s. And people like Barry Goldwater and all the Westerns on TV really lionized the idea of, that individualist guy out there. But I think over the last 40 years or more, it's actually more like 60 years now, right? That image has become one that simply says that by virtue of being a white guy who is willing to assert violence or assert masculinity, you are the people who should be directing society. And at the same time that that's happened, women, Black Americans, people of color, racial and gender and religious minorities have continued to focus on getting educations and on the skills that one needs to live in the 21st century. So where we seem to be right now is in a moment where people like President Donald Trump believe that they simply should be able to dictate the way the world is by virtue of who they are. Ironically, it's the kind of essentialism that they say that Black Americans and people of color are relying on, but I think it's really them. And that's sort of the way I'm thinking about our politics in this moment, because what I am seeing with things like the strikes on Iran and with things like happened with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. today in the hearings on the Hill and so on is the assertion of men who are accustomed to being able to dictate the terms of the world in which they live suddenly hitting up against reality and discovering that reality is not answering to their version of the world. And what I mean by that is this. If you think about Trump's strikes on Iran over the weekend, they did not come from nowhere. So actually, the U.S. has a very long history of nuclear involvement with Iran. It really begins after 1953, when, first of all, when the U.S. is involved in overturning a democratically elected leader of Iran and replacing that person with the man that a lot of us knew as the Shah of Iran, because the democratically elected leader had wanted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, or the Anglo-Iran oil company, and the British interests had more than half of the stock in that company, and they did not want that nationalization. So they get behind a coup that puts the Shah in place. And when that happens, the Shah begins to work pretty closely with the United States. And one of the things that they do is that in 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower, begins to recognize how very concerned people are about nuclear war. And he is himself, by the way, too. So he announces his program in 53 that's known as Atoms for Peace. And the idea is to switch the world's use of nuclear weapons to the idea of nuclear capabilities that are good for civilians, especially through energy. And what they do is not just the US, but a number of countries say that we will provide nuclear technologies to countries that promise to use it only for peaceful purposes. And Iran is one of the countries to which we provide both a reactor and enriched uranium in order for that to happen. But then, of course, just as the Shah is announcing that he's going to have 20 more nuclear reactors in his country, the Islamic Revolution happens. And in 1979, the U.S. Cuts ties with Iran, puts sanctions on them, and cuts ties with them because a number. I mean, I'm just doing a flyby here, because there are American hostages taken and held for 444 days in Tehran, and so with that, when the U.S. puts sanctions on Iran and cuts ties to Iran. What happens then is that the Iranians turn to Pakistan, China, and Russia to continue their nuclear program. Okay, so that's the backstory, the backstory. But from then on, the U.S. was terribly concerned about the use of those nuclear facilities, and especially the nuclear fuel, to have that it would be enriched, and the Iranians would use it to obtain a nuclear weapon. And so this has sort of been the backdrop from that. And in the same period, I'm talking about the 1990s and then the 2000s, the Republicans really start to flex their muscles internationally with the idea that the U.S. can simply throw their weight around. This was the project that the neocons, the conservatives, as they were called. I want to say neo-Confederates, and that's not, it's neoconservatives and neocons, really are saying that the U.S. ought to force countries, especially countries in the Middle East, to for regime change. They should force them to become democratic countries. And this is, of course, how we get involved, not how we get involved in Afghanistan. We get involved in Afghanistan after 9/11, but this is how we start to support the idea of regime change in Middle Eastern countries. Anyway, if that's the idea, that we should force people to do what we will through exertion of violence, you can see that with people like John McCain, the Arizona senator, talking in 2007 about bombing Iran. Remember, bomb Iran? That was 2007. And this idea that the way to stop the construction of a nuclear weapon is to through violence, is to force these people in Iran to do what we want. Well, the reason I started where I did today is that if you think about it, what happens is, for all the sort of saber rattling, it's actually Barack Obama, a Democratic president, a man of color in his second term, who begins in 2013 negotiations. Not, we're going to be a cowboy here, but we're really going to be the community. Remember, because the cowboy always rides off and the community then establishes the rules of law. We're going to negotiate, and we're going to find a way to make sure that the Iranians don't develop a nuclear weapon. And what comes out of that in 2015 is the JCPOA, the names of which I can never remember, but it's the Iran nuclear deal, as it's known. And what it says is that in exchange for a number of countries, not just the US, but a number of countries lifting sanctions on Iran, they will not enrich uranium, and they will destroy a lot of the enriched uranium that they have. That goes into effect in 2015. And when it does, or before it does, a number of Republican senators tried to blow up the deal. You know, they're like, we won't necessarily do this. We might bomb you, and this isn't a good thing. They're out there really shaking their fists at Iran, but the nuclear deal worked. There really is no argument that it didn't work. The international inspectors who went in to examine the places that Iran had been developing nuclear enriched fuel said that they were abiding by the rules and so on, but Trump insisted, first falsely, that there was this. He had this weird story about Obama sending pallets of cash and stuff. That's not what happened. And I can tell you about it if you want to know. But he kept saying this was a terrible deal. We should never have done it. This is a terrible deal. We should never have done it. And it did, in fact, return money to Iran that had been frozen in other countries, including the U.S., after the Islamic Revolution. But it did achieve what we wanted it to achieve. And in 2018, Trump blew that up. He tore that agreement up. And once the U.S. had pulled out, basically Iran said, we don't need to obey this any longer. And it began to enrich uranium again. So now, after all this time, and of course, Israel's got its own thing going on, because Netanyahu recognized that fighting Iran would enable him to consolidate his very rapidly waning power in Israel. And Trump kept saying, we shouldn't go in and bomb. We shouldn't be part of Israel's attacks on Iran. But as soon as as soon as Israel started to look really good on Fox News, Trump wanted in on that deal. He wanted to be the president who had actually bombed Iran. And so he did. And it appears to have accomplished very, very, very little. But it's really interesting today, if you read, and there's no reason you should, that's what I do, right? If you read Trump's Truth Social posts today, that account has been like on fire. It's been posting constantly how brilliant Trump is, how he was always right about everything, how he's brought peace to the world, and so on and so forth. And as you know, that, or maybe you don't, last night he said at about a little after 6 o'clock, he said that Iran and Israel had agreed to a ceasefire that was going to become a permanent peace. And of course, Israel violated that within 3 hours, and then Iran retaliated. And this morning he used profanity when he said that neither of those countries knows what the F they are doing because they've been fighting so long. And all day long, there has been this sense, to me anyway, of sort of frustration and anger on Trump's Truth Social account, where he's been screaming at people, alternately posting about how brilliant he is. And, it just sort of feels to me like what we are seeing is somebody who is recognizing now that negotiation is really hard. There's a reason that it took 2 years to get the JCPOA, and that was actually pretty quick compared to negotiations that sometimes drag on for years and years. And, he kept saying these Democrats are stupid. They don't know what they're doing. I can do this. These people of color, these women, they don't know what they're doing. I can just do this. And you can't. That's not actually the way the world works. And they're just this reality kind of intruding on that dominance politics to say, you can't just announce how things are going to be. That's a lovely thought until it isn't any longer. And when reality intrudes and you can't just say, well, I'm the smart one, I can handle this. When you actually are supposed to handle it, you often discover that you don't know what you're talking about. And this, by the way, is a hallmark of a narcissistic personality whose real strength comes from complaining about everybody else. They actually can't do much themselves. What they do is create chaos around themselves so that they can then step in and say, well, I would have done a better job. I'm the one who knew how to do things, and get attention and reinforcement of their own personalities that way. So in this moment, you're seeing Trump trying to insist that he has brought peace to the Middle East. And, maybe good luck to him with that. But it might have been that it was an excuse for other people to make peace. But heavens, if all you had to do was go in and announce that everything was going to be good from now on, don't you think somebody would have tried that before? So that idea, and the thing that I'm kind of playing with, as I say, is this idea of what happens when dominance politics, when these guys recognize that they are not actually the smartest guy in the room, the guy who knows how to do stuff, that they have fired all the people who know actually how to do things. And I think you see this with Pete Hegseth at Defense Secretary, who, he keeps screaming about how good he is at push-ups. But if you read military.com, as I do, that people are like, we kind of liked the guy who, I don't know, got us paychecks and food and actually knew how to run things, which doesn't have a lot to do necessarily with doing push-ups. It has to do with spending a lot of time in the uniform, learning how the systems work, getting an education, reading, all those values that dominance politics and cowboy individualism has really denigrated over the last 40 years. And that leads me into the other question that you asked about, which was, what about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and what is he doing there at Health and Human Services, and why on earth is he attacking vaccines? And the answer to that, I think, again, goes back to the idea that he thinks he knows stuff other people don't think. And I think it's been pretty well established now. I've written about it in the past, but I didn't do the research. Other people did. That he doesn't believe in germ theory the way that scientists believe in germ theory. Remember, he's not a doctor. He is not a public health professional, and he is not a scientist. And since the 1980s in the United States, earlier in other countries, people who study diseases recognize that they are caused by germs, bacteria, things that invade our bodies, and that those can be treated in various ways. And one of the ways you prevent getting diseases like measles, for example, is with a vaccine, in which they give you weakened versions of the disease, and your body learns to fight it off. That's how a vaccine works, and that is accepted among scientists. Now, what Kennedy believes, apparently, is that germs exist, and in the 1880s, the people who didn't believe in germ theory didn't actually think germs existed. He believes they exist, but he believes that if your body is sufficiently healthy, you will be able to fight those things off, which is why when people die of measles, for example, he said, oh, well, they were undernourished, or, you don't have to worry about these diseases unless you're not eating right, or any of the many things he says. You can build up your body by taking these supplements and so on, which, by the way, are a multi-billion-dollar business. But the truth is that while it's, of course, a wonderful thing to eat right and to get exercise and do all those things our doctors tell us to do, germs are real and they make you sick. And so is bacteria, and it makes you sick. And he is trying to impose this idea of his by saying everybody else is wrong. They're just trying to make money off you. I'm the one who is really going to show you how things operate. And the problem with that, of course, is that people are already dying from measles, and they're dying from the kinds of cures that he is offering for strengthening their bodies. And I think you see there again, I know better than you do by virtue of who I am. And our society has been ruined, people like that would argue, by the government programs that insist on educations for people of color, Black Americans, women, and so on, who really don't have the essential nature that will enable them to see the truth the way somebody like Kennedy could. So when I'm thinking about the larger picture, I'm looking at this quite mythical ideology, an ideology that is based around a myth, but the extraordinary reaction of the people who embrace it to the fact that the people who really know how to get stuff done are the people that they're firing and the people that they're undermining. And that how does that play out in terms of, the real world saying, wait a minute, actually, vaccines keep you alive. And actually, negotiations are really hard. And if you look at the way that Trump has completely tanked the economy, not completely. I mean, he's cut economic growth by about half, and people are facing mass layoffs and so on. That too, it was great to say, I know how to run these things. I can do this. This is easy. But the minute he tried to do this with his brilliant tariffs, we're facing the highest costs right now of toys, for example. The rates of the cost of toys has gone through the roof because of his tariffs. And we're already seeing inflation in all these different areas, like I say. And that reality is starting to hit. And I think that one of the reasons you're seeing this anger from Trump is that he thought he could just step in and fix everything because he knew how to do it, and the rest of us were stupid. And now they're discovering that, in fact, it does take bureaucrats, and it does take people who understand how the world works. And negotiation is not something you can just walk into. You actually have to know how to negotiate. You can't just say, I'm the one who can do this. And so that's the big picture of the stuff that I am looking at. All right. I hope that covered a lot of stuff, but I'm going to cover a couple more things that you asked about. The bill, the omnibus bill, the budget reconciliation bill that the Republicans are trying to force through Congress is now under scrutiny from the Senate parliamentarian. Let me remind you again who the Senate parliamentarian is. She is a lawyer generally. In this case, she is a lawyer who looks at a bill to see whether or not it is adhering to the rules of budget reconciliation. Have they shoved stuff in there that does not belong there? Because what can go through The Senate, under the rules, under budget reconciliation rules, are measures that have very strict requirements that can only have to do with the budget. And so both parties try and shove stuff into budget reconciliation bills because they can't be filibustered, that really don't belong there. And so she's been going through it and saying, now you can't put that in there. Now you can't put that in there. Now you can't put that in there. She's cut out a lot of stuff that people like me found very problematic. Before you send up skyrockets, however, the Senate is not obliged to listen to the Senate parliamentarian. They usually do, but they don't have to. And their argument would be, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. We're going to go ahead and pass this, and then we're going to test it out in court. And it is possible that they will do that. I'm quite nervous about that myself, but as you know, I don't predict the future. So that's where the bill is right now. Keep calling, keep putting on pressure. It is extremely unpopular. The bill is. The other thing you asked about was the Supreme Court decision of yesterday on the shadow docket, or the emergency docket, which means that the majority of the Supreme Court decided it without hearings and without explaining why they why they came down the way they did. And that was a decision that said that it was lawful for the administration to send migrants to the United States to countries other than their country of origin, including war-torn countries, because the administration is trying to they're trying to make lives for migrants so miserable that they stop coming. That's the plan. And that the idea is to send people to countries where they don't speak the language, they're in the middle of a war, they're in danger, so that it sends a signal to other migrants not to come to the US. And lower courts have said you can't do that. And the Supreme Court has just said, oh, yes, you can, at least for now. And that, I think, again, goes back to the dominance politics that the 6 members of the Supreme Court adhere to. The idea that if you are not a white man, if you're a migrant, a person of color, you don't have rights. You don't have the same rights that a white male American does. And so I'm seeing that same pattern there. Now, there's a lot of the immigration stuff that is deeply, deeply problematic. And again, I'm still trying to play with it and fit it into worldviews, because that's kind of what I do, is figure out how people are thinking about the world. Now, the one thing that I have said to you consistently and will continue to say to you is this summer is going to be bad. This summer, you can already see, as I say, lots of surprises. The strikes on Iran are surprises. Trump's melting down today is, I think, a sign of his anger and frustration. You know that he has been roundly criticized. His poll numbers are underwater on absolutely everything, including on striking Iran. And first there was the brouhaha with Elon Musk, who clearly was calling a lot of the shots in the White House. Now there are more and more reports that it's Stephen Miller who is actually calling the shots in the White House, certainly with regard to immigration. And, I think Trump is frustrated and he's angry, and he's 79 years old, and there's a lot on his plate, and he is not able to handle it. That's going to mean that there's a lot of chaos in the White House, a lot of chaos in the country, a lot of chaos in Congress, where people are very unhappy. Not just the Democrats, but Republicans as well are very unhappy with each other and with Donald Trump. And they recognize that the things the administration is doing are extremely unpopular. Congress itself is so bitterly divided, they can't seem to get anything passed. We're facing a real problem with hitting the debt ceiling. And Congress is also unable at this point to hammer out a budget for next year, which is at this point too late. They'll manage to do something. They have to do something, but the members of the administration have not actually been producing the budgets they're supposed to produce. And so it's not really possible. There's a wonderful clip that I hope to write about on in the Senate the other day. Senator King from Maine, Angus King from Maine, was grilling the Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum. And he said, what are you doing here? First of all, he was complaining about the cuts to the public lands, and he was doing so very effectively. I'll write about that. But he literally picked up the budget from 2025, which was like this thing. It was this big thing of paper. And he said, this is the budget for last year. And then he held up a piece of paper and he goes, a piece of paper, maybe a few pieces of paper, and said, and this is your budget for this year. What are you doing over there? Because you've got, you're clearly not even trying to produce a budget. So they've got that on the table and everybody's fighting with each other. So the summer's going to be a lot coming at us. And at the same time, people are losing their jobs and stuff is the wheels are starting to come off things like the Social Security Administration, where wait times are twice what they were under the Biden administration already. And there's going to be a lot of discomfort and chaos around the country in the United States and also, of course, around the world. People are dying in large numbers already from cuts to U.S. aid. So be prepared for that going forward, because it's just going to be rough. Take care of each other, take care of your friends, spend time with your friends. That's going to be really important. But also, if you possibly can face it, keep your oar in, go to local things, go to state things, talk to your state representatives, put pressure on media, put pressure on your representatives, both at the local and the state and the national level. Call out what you see, defend your neighbors who are being picked up by whoever is wearing those masks. I maintain we still don't know who they are. This is going to be as the wheels increasingly come off the administration bus, this is the time to keep pressure on, because you just can't let this administration settle into a position of power, because it's going to have to, as it gets more and more chaotic, we're going to have to keep the pressure on. And the other piece of this that I really urge you to remember is, Pete Buttigieg has talked about this, J.B. Pritzker has talked about this, a number of people are talking about this, that we need to envision what we want out of the country and how we can help make that happen. Because there's a lot of really talented people who are not currently in power. And that's a good thing, because we are able to articulate what we might want. What does that look like? What are your issues? What do you want to see fixed? What do you want to see invested in? Because it is simply bonkers, as my friend Joanne would say, that one of the things, for example, that Senator King said the other day to Secretary of Interior Burgum, is King said, if the budget is from the floor to the ceiling in this hearing room, the public lands, which you have slashed, which are already underfunded and you have slashed, are the equivalent of 2 credit cards stacked together, way down there. Why are you doing this? What is the point of doing this? And I think that's the question we all have to be asking ourselves, is what is the point of our government and what do we want out of it? What do we want to fund? There's an awful lot of stuff being funded now that I sure don't feel good about. The new detention facilities that ICE wants, the enormous amounts of money we're putting into rounding up our neighbors. Those are our tax dollars. That's our money that this administration is choosing to spend in those ways. The military parades. Hey, the strikes on Iran were extraordinarily expensive. The strikes on the Houthis, which cost more than $350 million just in lost equipment alone, between the drones that were lost at more than $200 million and the 2 fighter planes that were lost at more than $60 million apiece. That didn't even open up the Red Sea again to American traffic. So I think we need to think about how we want to be spending our money and investing in the organizations, both our time and our money and our support, in ways they can do that. And that's, I think, really important, because we're going to have to be able to articulate that when the wheels really do come off this bus, as they seem to be doing. All right. I'm hot, and I'm sure you are as well. So I'm going to let you go, and I'll pick a lot more of this stuff up on Thursday. And I hope that was not at least too much a on your plate or too much a waste of your time on this incredibly hot day. So anyway, keep cool. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you on Thursday. Hey folks, this says that it has gone live, and while we wait for the Facebook people to come in, I'm going to answer at least one question that I saw, and that is someone asked, why do I always say I like Pittsburgh? What's not to like? It's a beautiful area. It's got phenomenal history. It's got amazing art. It's got world-class educational facilities. It's got great restaurants. I don't live there obviously, but I always enjoy going to Pittsburgh and that part of the country. It's such a pretty part of the country. So yeah, I have a soft spot for Pittsburgh. It is not my favorite city. I do have a favorite city. It's Memphis. Although I like many cities, Memphis is another one where the history and the natural beauty and of course, the music and the food and everything, I just adore. And the architecture in Memphis, because it was never really renovated in the period when they were putting up so many ugly buildings, just always makes it a joy to go to Memphis as well. But there are a lot of ones I like. All right. So I'm not sure we're seeing Facebook yet. Let's see if they come in. We're having trouble interfacing with Facebook these days. So maybe they're here, maybe they're not here. So I just saw somebody is here from Memphis, and I didn't see what you said about oh, there we got another Memphis person here. Nashville. Nashville's an interesting place as well. I am not seeing Facebook come in, which if you are here from Facebook, I'd love it if you would identify yourselves, because I kind of like to make sure that we're broadcasting there too, but it has not, I haven't been showing up there as much as I should be. So maybe they're just not going to be able to come in today, which is unfortunate. It says I'm broadcasting over there, but I'm not seeing anybody here. All right, well, why don't I get a jump on it, and then maybe it'll show up on Facebook later. So first of all, thank you for being here. Second of all, you had a lot of questions. Oh, here's Facebook. All of a sudden, hi, Facebook people. We whipped by, so I'm not sure if Danny is here. If you are Danny, I know I owe you a letter, and I am on it in a number of different ways. And here's Nashville and Arizona and Wisconsin. I will tell you, on Tuesday when I did the other politics chat, it was like 100 degrees in here. And today it's so cold that over at our house, Buddy's got a fire going. Welcome to life in Maine, right? All right, so now let me get down to it and hit some of the questions that you asked about. You're asking a lot of questions about why President Donald Trump is so adamant that in fact he destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities in those strikes over the weekend. And one of the funny things that's happened with that over the last 2 days is he has started to say that the reason he cares so deeply is because people are disrespecting the pilots who flew the planes that dropped the bombs. And that's a really weird, if you will, distraction, because nobody is saying that the military didn't do their job. I literally have not seen that anywhere except coming from him, because he's trying to make this seem like he's doing something, for the military. And come on, let's call it. He doesn't do anything for the military. So it's just that's a weird thing. But it's part of his absolute determination to sell Americans on a story. And I actually think there's a number of things going on with that. The first thing that I think, and by the way, feel free to disagree. This is just sort of my impressions from looking at this. And of course, I do not have any view into Trump's inner circle. So this is me looking from the outside in. But one of the things that really jumps out to me is the degree to which Trump has conceived of his strikes on Iran as sort of a TV series, sort of a made for TV movie. Because if you remember, when Israel struck Iran, the United States was supposed to be negotiating with Iran 2 days later. And Trump was like, no, we're going to go with negotiations. Israel bombs Iran. And when that happened, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who was also the acting national security advisor, came out and said, we had nothing to do with it. That was a unilateral move. We're not doing that. And within a day, Trump was sort of hinting that he'd kind of been behind it. And now we know from reporting from within the White House, that from sources within the White House, that he was watching on the Fox News channel and saw how it was reporting those Israeli strikes as being, interesting and powerful and a success and so on. And he wanted in on that. So he devised this strike and this storyline that said that he, after many decades now of Americans trying to negotiate with the Iranians over their nuclear weapons program, and I talked last Tuesday about the history of that. And the complaints of Republicans that America wasn't simply bombing Iran, even in the negotiations for the joint JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the Iran nuclear deal, that was working. But they still seem to want to bomb it because that's sort of their, that whole power dynamic that they're going to dominate things is very much embedded in the Republican Party at this point. So he did that, and then he instantly said, "I've totally obliterated their nuclear program. It's way too early to tell. It's going to be a very long time before anybody has any definitive answers." But then almost immediately he named it. He gave it a name, almost like a title, the 12-Day War. And the reason that I'm mentioning that today is because he continues to insist that this is what happened, even though the Pentagon itself has said, no, we think there was damage done, but the system is not obliterated. And this morning, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth gave a press conference in which he was really combative, seemingly very angry. Remember, he's a media guy himself. And he literally said, and I think I can quote it here, yes, he insisted that the president had completely obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons program, and said, and I quote, President Trump directed the most complex and secretive military operation in history, and it was a resounding success, resulting in a ceasefire agreement and the end of the 12-Day War. Doesn't that sound like the description of a movie or something? And of course, it's ridiculous, too. If you want to say that strike was successful, that's one thing, but it certainly was not the most complex and secretive military operation in history, to which people point to things like D-Day, which on June 6, 1944, took a year of planning, involved soldiers and sailors from 13 different nations and their commanders and their political leaders, and ended up involving more than 150,000 soldiers and almost 200,000 sailors. So the idea that somehow Trump has one-upped D-Day with this strike on Iran is just fantasy. It's just a fantasy. So why? Partly because I think he loves this package. It's a made-for-TV moment, but also partly because he is having a real problem right now with reality. And I don't mean that just personally, although I think he is personally having a hard time with reality. I think he is having an extremely difficult time separating out what is real and what is not. But also because as he is putting his fantasy into place, the American people don't like it and they're pushing back, and he's in real trouble. And I'll tell you more about that in just a minute with his numbers. But he wants us to believe his world, not our reality. He wants to say, this is what is really happening. And I'm going to shut up the media, and I'm going to shut up the Pentagon. And this is real because this is what I want to be real. So I think that's part of it. So that's one. The first is the made for TV thing. The second is that he wants us to believe his reality rather than actual reality. And this has sort of a larger version of the argument that his inaugural crowds were bigger than Barack Obama's, which was also just ridiculous on the face of it. But he insisted on it. And that is a sign of a rising authoritarian when they're determined for you to believe their reality rather than your own. Because even if you don't actually believe them, if you say you believe them, you're kind of stuck in their world. But then I think there is quite possibly a third thing. And that is, we learned today from CNN, a CNN exclusive, that all the while that the Trump administration has been talking to Iran in, theoretically to come up with a new way to limit their nuclear capabilities, their nuclear weapons capabilities. Members of the administration have also been engaged in secret talks to try to end Iran's nuclear weapons aspirations with a series of benefits to Iran that probably will not play well in the United States. So the CNN reporters say that on the table right now are secret talks to ease the sanctions on Iran, to free up billions of dollars of assets of Iran's that have been frozen, and also to help Iran get between 20 and 30 let me get the right number here, 20 and 30 billion dollars to build their own nuclear plants for nuclear energy. And the reason that I mean, that's a CNN story. I have not yet seen the reactions to that CNN story. But all of a sudden, it made me recall, I don't know if you remember this, but in 2016, when Trump's campaign for president actually seemed to be taking off because it had really been in the toilet, basically. And Paul Manafort came on board, and remember, and he starts to get help from Russian operatives and so on. Well, in that summer of 2016, Jared Kushner and Michael Flynn, who was later to be Trump's national security advisor, and he had to resign, and after it turned out he was talking to the Russians and shouldn't have been, and then he lied to the FBI, and that's its own rabbit hole I won't go into. But they started a company, and the company was called IP3 International, and IP3 International stood for something peace and prosperity. International, I think. Let's see. Yeah. International Peace, Power, and Prosperity. And that was a company that was designed to work with Russia to build nuclear reactors in Saudi Arabia. So obviously Iran was not involved in that, as far as I know, from the public material stuff. But that idea of building nuclear reactors in the Middle East is not brand new for this administration. And I don't know what it means. I don't know how it's going to fall out. I just know there was a lot of mess over IP3 and the fact that the first Trump administration was trying to get nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. And there was all kinds, you can Google that, there was all kinds of brouhaha about that because it looked like they were violating a law when they did that. But that may be another reason that he's trying to say, I obliterated their nuclear program, now we can all be friends again, which in fact is what he put on his social media accounts. Congratulations, world, we have peace now. So that he could switch the conversation from, we've got this problem with nuclear proliferation in Iran, to, that's okay, I took care of that. Now we can help probably the other Arab states rebuild Iran, and we will be able to put in these nuclear reactors. I don't know. And that's that's out there now in a way that, quite frankly, I was surprised by, but it doesn't ring false to me because of that earlier IP3 program. All right. That's not all you asked about, though. You asked about the budget reconciliation bill that the Republicans have called the One Big Beautiful Bill. And that's just its name, which is one of the reasons people keep using that is its official name. When they write a bill, either the House or the Senate, there is a number attached to it. It's either HR 101 or S101. I'm making that up, for House of Representatives or Senate. And then usually they will also name a bill. So it's got a number and a name, and the numbers are far more useful if you're trying to look it up and follow it. So you can actually, if you want to Google this, I'm using that word generically. If you want to put this into your search engine, if you put in the number of the bill, you will actually get the legislative history of the bill, including a summary of it, and information from the clerks who put all that stuff out there. You can learn more about it too if you want, but that's a good place to start. Anyway, the trick to that bill is that it needs to go through the Congress under what's called budget reconciliation. And the reason that matters is because, and I've talked about this a million times, so some of you are going to be bored when I say this again. The Senate filibuster is basically a reflection of the fact that the Senate never developed a way to make its members stop talking. The House of Representatives got big enough, quickly enough, that they recognized they did have to have a way to shut people up. And so they have a system for saying, the debate's over, now we're going to move forward. The Senate doesn't have that. So the Senate filibuster is essentially just, senators can keep talking forever if they want to. You can't shut them up unless the Senate votes with 60 votes to do that. It's called cloture, if you've seen that. And that means that essentially a member of the Senate could stop legislation ever from happening if they could simply hold the floor forever so that nothing could move forward. They changed that rule, I think it was in the 1970s, to say you didn't actually have to stand and filibuster. You didn't actually have to stand and talk any longer and hold the floor. You could just say you were going to do that. And the Senate decided that in order to actually get some business done, they had to exempt certain categories from the filibuster. So say you can't filibuster this. So you can't filibuster certain judgeships, for example. And one of the things you cannot filibuster as a senator are a certain kind or certain kinds of financial measures, so that the government actually, one person can't shut down the entire US government. It makes sense. And one of those measures is budget reconciliation. So budget reconciliation measures can make it through the Senate with a simple majority. They cannot be filibustered. All right, and that was designed to mean that you would just get them through, and people wouldn't fight about them over partisan things. You'd just make sure they got through. Mind you, I am not defending these. I think there's a huge number of problems with the way Congress runs today. And I don't like these giant bills. But anyway, so because the Republicans have razor thin majorities in both the House and the Senate, and because a lot of what they want is enormously unpopular, especially what the MAGA Republicans want, Trump insisted on putting everything they want into his one big, beautiful bill, the budget reconciliation bill, because they could get it all through with a majority vote, and there was nothing the Democrats could do about it. So this is what we have been talking about now for months, is that the Republicans shoved everything into that bill, horrible stuff into that bill. And one of the things that people like me has been focusing on a lot is the fact that it dramatically cuts Medicaid over the next 10 years, and it extends Trump's tax cuts from 2017 so that a lot of the government programs that we like, not just Medicaid, but also the supplemental nutrition assistance programs, or SNAP, what we used to know as food stamps, but many different aspects of the government that we like, including energy credits, for example, that are helping America to wean itself off fossil fuels, and which actually polls show are enormously popular. Those things were in the bill, as well as some of the other things that you have heard about, things like making it very difficult to enforce a contempt of court act, for example, selling off some of the public lands. There's a whole bunch of things that were in that bill. So they put everything in that bill with the idea that they were just going to be able to shove it through under budget reconciliation. But much of that bill is enormously unpopular. I mean, crazy unpopular. That bill is underwater so far. I think the number of people who actually like it is like 27%. It's that low. And then the people who hate it are in the 50% range. So, high. So the Republicans have a real problem because Trump wants that bill. He wants those tax cuts. That's really huge for him. He wants those tax cuts. And at the same time, the Republicans, especially the Republican senators and representatives who are in vulnerable districts, are like, if we slash Medicaid, we're done here, because slashing Medicaid will not only hurt the people who are on Medicaid, it will dramatically hurt especially rural areas whose hospitals and nursing homes depend on Medicaid supplements. So you're actually looking at the closure of a lot of hospitals and elder care facilities, which will hit rural areas especially really, really hard. I know, I live in one. So the Republicans have been like, we're not keen on what we're doing here. And Trump's saying, but you got to pass it, you got to pass it, you got to pass it. Well, that's where they're sitting right now. And the Republican senators, a lot of them are like, we just cannot pass this. We're going to get shellacked in the next election. So what's happening right now is that the Senate has an officer called the Senate parliamentarian, which good luck spelling, by the way. I was writing about it recently and I finally gave up. The Senate parliamentarian, see, there you go. The Senate parliamentarian is a nonpartisan person who looks at legislation in the Senate and says, yeah, this is legal. You can do this. Your rules and the regulations of the Senate and the laws say you can do this. But no, you can't do that. And with the Senate parliamentarian, a woman named Elizabeth McDonough, who has been in the job since 2012, has said is she looked at this bill, which is over 1,000 pages long, and she has been going through it and saying, you can't do this under budget reconciliation, because remember I said it had to be related to the budget. It was financial. So one of the things she tossed out today was cuts to Medicaid. And she's thrown out some of the other stuff as well, including the thing about making it so difficult to enforce a contempt of court order. So right now, what's happening is the Senate parliamentarian is saying, I'm telling you, you can't have these things in this bill. And the trick is that she really has no electoral authority. The Senate could override her. They could vote to say, we're not going to listen to her. And a lot of the MAGA Republicans want to do that. But Senator John Thune, who was the Senate Majority Leader, today said, we're not going to do that. And that's a really interesting thing on his part, because in a way, it's really helpful for the Republicans not to have to go on record as cutting Medicaid, for example. There's a lot of really unpopular things in that bill that they didn't really want to vote on. And she has taken them out, or she said, you need to take these things out so that they can vote in favor of the bill that Trump wants, but then they can, the things that she has stripped out, they can be like, sorry, we couldn't do that, and sort of shift the blame onto her. But the downside of that for them, in the popular view, that's a really good thing for them, because they can, most people don't understand about the Senate parliamentarian, so they can be like, no, we stripped that out of the bill. But the MAGA Republicans don't want those tax cuts, which are going to explode the deficit and explode the debt even more. Here's actually a little piece that you may not know. You know, the deficit is the yearly amount, you know, how much the United States brings in revenue versus how much it sends out in programs and debt payments and so on. That is one number. But when they figure the debt, when economists figure the debt, they also have to figure in the amount of interest one pays on the debt. So there's a difference between the deficit and the debt, but there's also a difference in the way we look at the numbers. Even if you say I'm cutting this much out, you know, we're going to be this much in the red this year, that's a certain number. When you shift it into the debt, it actually has to bear the interest costs of funding that debt. And so that number is going to be higher. Anyway, that was a rabbit hole, but I think it's an interesting one. And that's why you often see two numbers. Someone says, oh, it's going to blow up the deficit by this much, but the debt by this much plus stuff. And you're like, why is that? That's why. Anyway, the MAGA Republicans don't want to blow up the debt or the deficit. And they're adamant that they don't want to do that. So if the Senate parliamentarian has stripped those numbers out, they may not want to pass the bill at all. And Trump is insisting it has to be passed by July 4th, which is right around the corner. So that's where that bill stands now, and you should continue to speak up about it. I'll speak more about that in just a minute. All right. The other things that you asked about are, one is you asked why the number of Democrats voted not to go forward with impeachment recently. And you can disagree with this, by the way, but the reason for that is, first of all, not to interrupt what's that old saying about don't interrupt your enemy when they're destroying themselves? Trump has overreached so extraordinarily in so many ways that his numbers are plummeting. So one of the numbers that came out, I think it was yesterday, it might have been today, from Quinnipiac University, which does polling, does good polling, is that since Trump started his deportations of, well, a lot of people, not just undocumented immigrants, but since he has begun that, um, American support among registered voters, and there's another little bit of a rabbit hole. People often do polling and they talk about Americans versus sometimes they talk about registered voters. That's a really important distinction because Americans rarely like what the Republicans are doing, but not all Americans show up to vote. Registered voters are people who show up to vote. So registered voters, since Trump took office, have swung 14 points toward wanting a path to legal citizenship for people who are already in this country. Like, you can't produce numbers like that with any kind of advocacy in the world, except people being horrified by what he's doing. Similarly, Trump's trade war has prices are rising significantly already. Today, he said he has inked a deal with China, which is news to everybody, suggests that he doesn't know what he's doing. The things that he is doing to himself are really damaging to him. And the idea, I suspect, behind the Democrats who say we shouldn't move forward now with impeachment, although heaven knows, I said we were in a constitutional crisis the first day he was in office, is that it will shift focus off of those things that are making people really angry and turning them against the administration and shift them on to impeachment. At which point the MAGA Republicans are going to come out swinging in favor of Trump. And that's really going to change the national dynamic. Because one of the things that somebody said today, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, that I thought was really interesting, is that if you think about they were only talking about one particular thing, but if you think about the things that Trump has embroiled himself in, the trade war, certainly the stuff with attacking the migrants in our midst, he doesn't really have a way out. It looks, as somebody said, like LBJ in Vietnam. Once he is in it, it's very, very difficult to find a way out. What can he do now to get out of the mess he has made with immigration without upsetting his base? And he can't stay in without upsetting the rest of us. Similarly, on the trade war, how does he extricate himself from that? He has done so by saying, oh, I'm going to ink all these deals and they're going to be great. But, so far that has not materialized. So there's a lot of reason for the Democrats simply to spend their time pushing back on him in public, which is what they're doing. And they're doing it, fairly effectively, but simply staying out of his way as he is destroying himself is not a bad strategy. In the long term, of course, it's enormously painful in the short term. But I think that's probably what they're doing. And like I say, I'm explaining it. I'm not suggesting you have to agree with it. I think I know I'm a Libra, but it does seem to me that there are very good arguments on both sides. And I would be happy to make the other argument as well. Don't even start me. But I think that's what they're doing. That's what you asked. The other thing that I think is really important in this moment that you asked about, so I'll throw it in here, is Zohran Mamdani's election to be the Democratic candidate for mayor in New York City in the upcoming election. Because I think what we are seeing in this moment, and of course it's hard because we're in it, but the overreach of the Trump administration, the extraordinary overreach that has really made it crystal clear that the MAGA Republicans are in this to line their own pockets. And certainly the Trump family is in it to line his own pocket. I mean, come on, the airplane from Qatar, and that's who it was, right? Whoever it was. And the deals with foreign countries and the crypto, I mean, the criming is off the charts here. And at the same time, the willingness of the Republicans to freaking cut Medicaid and SNAP. I mean, go after the weakest people among us. And then to turn around and have talked in the campaign about getting rid of murderers and rapists. And then, dragging off the street a landscaper whose three sons were Marines, and mothers and children, and separating children. It's really, really extreme, and illustrates the degree to which our system has been taken over by a very small group of people who are commandeering it for their own benefit. And the rest of us can, you know, go hang as far as they're concerned. So, and the comparison that I'm making here in my mind anyway is to the late 19th century. When that happens, when enough people recognize that has happened, they start to look for new leaders. And one of the things that the Democrats did after 1965, when we get the Voting Rights Act of 65, the parties have to decide what they're going to do. And immediately after 65, the Republican Party under Nixon in 68 really moves along the lines that Barry Goldwater had outlined in 1964. That is, they start down the path to white supremacy. They start to divide the American people quite deliberately. It was a strategy called positive polarization. Positive because it would turn out people to vote for Republicans, is what the way they conceived it. That ended up where we are now, where we have a very small group of largely white Americans who are turning on the rest of us. And they went down that path, but the Democrats didn't. The Democrats started in 68 in their incredibly messy convention that year. But then in the years after 68 into 72, reworking their system to make it far more inclusive. And what they got for that in 72 was an absolute landslide for the Republicans. They ended up with their candidate, George McGovern of South Dakota, winning only the state of Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. He didn't even win his own home state, which is almost impossible for somebody to lose their home state. And when that happened, and going, of course, then we got Watergate and we got Jimmy Carter, who was an incredibly impressive man in a number of ways, a really impressive man, and an impressive president, by the way. But we got Jimmy Carter, and then Carter lost, obviously, in 1980 to Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan's going down that path. The Democrats had gone down a different path under Carter in the 70s and under Carter, but a lot of Democrats then looked at Reagan and the fact Reagan picked up the American white working class and said, we need to be more like Reagan. Instead of saying, screw it, we're going to run down this aisle, they kind of worked more with the establishment. Now, they didn't fall in entirely with the Republican, the things they could in the space of a country that had begun to embrace that Reagan revolution. You see Bill Clinton, for example, and the Democrats under Clinton dramatically expanding the right to vote in 1993 with the Motor Voter Act and trying to protect different aspects of the social safety net that the Republicans were coming for and so on. And of course, under Clinton, we get a balanced budget. And the first thing that happens when George W. Bush takes over is he blows that up because he doesn't want the government to have the programs that Americans want. So the Democrats kind of are trying to preserve that care for ordinary Americans, but it was within sort of the parameters of a world that was looking much more like a right center country than a center country than it had been. Well, when you look then at the past 40 years in the United States and you look at the media that has blamed the Democrats for that, much more than the Republicans who were putting in place the tax cuts that did, in fact, move $50 trillion from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Especially younger Americans look at this system and they say, we don't want any part of this. We want something different. And that, I think, is where you get the nomination of somebody like Mamdani, who is a self-declared democratic socialist. But a lot of what people who call themselves democratic socialists embrace in the 1950s would literally have been a Republican program. So that refocusing, I think, is an incredibly interesting moment. But I also think it is going to be rough I think everything's going to be rough. Who am I kidding? But the reason I say that is because we went through something very similar in the late 19th century. And what happened was, as soon as the Democrats in the late 19th century started to speak out against the robber barons under people like Grover Cleveland, who was enormously popular. I mean, it's interesting, he's been read out of the history books. As soon as that happened, opponents were like, he's a socialist, he's a communist, these people need to be thrown out of America, et cetera, which is literally what Andy Ogles of Tennessee said today about Mamdani. You start to see this idea, this sort of last gasp of, if we let these people have power, we're going to become a communist country. Well, at this point, America has crossed over the line into authoritarianism on the right. So the idea that somehow somebody who is saying that we should actually build affordable housing is going to destroy the country is, again, part of a fantasy. But when that happened, in those early elections in the 1890s, there were a few people who were actually far to the left of Mamdani who were elected. But there was a backlash against them, which made it quite hard for them to get elected or to govern once they were in power. But what happened, at least in the 19th century, and it's worth thinking about this and what might happen now, is that younger politicians looked at the popularity of the programs that these people were putting forward. And some of the programs, by the way, in the late 19th century were kind of bonkers. We know that now, but at the time they didn't really understand how government financing worked or whatever. But they looked at that and they said, I want those voters. And those programs aren't such a bad idea. And from that, you saw younger politicians, including in the Republican pro-robber baron party at the time, embracing those reforms that had been originally associated with the Democrats or with socialists, and embracing them themselves and bringing them into the major parties. So by 1900, both major parties were calling for reform. And by 1912, there were four major people running, people from major parties running for president. And in that election, all four of them were progressive candidates. So for me, the nomination, not the nomination, he'll be running as the candidate, the Democratic candidate in the mayoral election. That election and the fact that he has gotten the power he has and rejected Cuomo, who, let's face it, was not a good candidate, is about New York for sure, which is always its own microcosm or macrocosm. It's a pretty big city. But it's also about this political moment where I think across the country, Americans are looking at the skewing of this system toward a very few wealthy people that has taken the ability to work hard and rise away from huge numbers of Americans, especially young Americans. And they're saying, we're done. This is not the country we want to live in. And that's a watershed. At least it feels like a watershed moment. So we'll see. That was, you asked my take on it. And that's what my take is on that. Regardless of what Mamdani is proposing, regardless of what the other people are proposing, regardless of the details, the larger picture seems to be a picture of a population that has said, enough is enough. We need to get our democracy back. All right. Once again, I am going to urge you now of all times to speak up about what you want for this country, and you do it at all the usual levels, at the local level, go to meetings, at the state level, same thing, at the national level, reach out to anybody who is in an elected office, run for elected office, but also show up to school board meetings or to church meetings or to any of the public spaces where people care about our country and care about issues that maybe I don't mention very often: fixing the roads, protecting the alewives, I'm here in Maine, protecting the public lands, protecting the universities, the things that you care about, and talk about why that's important to you. Because it is very clear to me from somebody like Mamdani that politicians are listening, and they are listening, the younger ones, the ones who are just up and running now. And the more they hear from you about the things you care about, the more likely it is that that's going to get translated into action. So that and continuing to recognize that there is joy in creation and there is joy in hard work, and that where we are is really miserable in a lot of ways, but it's also a time to meet new people and to try new things and to reach out and make your own life the most creative it can be, because I keep reiterating authoritarianism cannot thrive in a land where people are making community connections and are doing so with joy. So I urge you to keep on doing whatever it is that makes you want to keep on. And one last thing, I have been extraordinarily fortunate in the interviews that I have been able to do lately. And I am excited tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and we'll post it. So if you can't make it, don't worry about it, to be able to interview Zach Everson, who is a journalist from Forbes that I don't know personally, but he writes about crypto and about how crypto is important now, both for the administration and for the things it's doing, like making it an asset that you can consider for a mortgage and so on, for backstopping a mortgage. And I don't know what he's going to say. I don't even know what kind of an interview it's going to be. But I'm really, speaking of reaching into, that's what made me think of it. Speaking of reaching into things that you're good at and that you care about, I love to hear people talk about things that they care about and that they're knowledgeable about. And I suddenly have a platform where I can talk to people who know stuff and are willing to talk to me about it. And so I invite you to come listen to what Zach has to say so we can figure out this crypto thing and what they're, I'm sorry to say, what they seem to be pulling on us. And if you can't see it, then you can see it on my YouTube channel, which some of you are on now, and on Facebook as well. All right, thank you for being here. And I will see you tomorrow if you're around. Otherwise, I will be back on Tuesday. Thanks for being here. Ypsilanti, Michigan, man, great town. Hi, everybody. I can see that you're starting to come here in now. And Facebook is now in as well. Another one from Ypsilanti. I hope you do know each other. There's a great story about Ypsilanti that, someday I'll get to do history again. But there was an Indian agent who ended up on a Lakota reservation in what is now South Dakota in the 1880s, and he worked with Lakota who was hilariously funny. And the guy used to totally make fun of him for his sort of filling all the positions with people from Ypsilanti, Michigan. So someday, if I ever get to do history again, I will tell that story in more fully. But that's how I learned about Ypsilanti before I actually went there after my daughter was at UMich. So anyway, I have a soft spot for Ypsilanti. Glad you are all here from Virginia, Indiana, and so on. I'm going to start right in today because I know people are pretty anxious about things that are going on. But I'm going to start with a place that you don't expect me to start, because I wrote last night's letter, and then I woke up, and I didn't wake up. I went to bed, and normally that means I'm done. It was 2:30 and I'm really done. And I couldn't sleep because I had written the wrong letter. So it was bothering me all night. And instead I did it today, and I've just rearranged it. And, it's a lot of important stuff, because one of the things that hasn't really gotten a lot of press today because of the budget reconciliation bill going through the Senate is that today is the anniversary of the Supreme Court case, Donald J. Trump versus United States. And I'm going to submit that this is, as I said at the time, the most important case in American history, but it's certainly the case that has put us where we are now. So what was that case? It was the case in which the Supreme Court overthrew the central tenet of American history and the American government, that no man is above the law. And what it said in Donald J. Trump v. United States is that the president of the United States has absolute immunity, cannot be prosecuted for crimes committed as part of his official acts. and that he should be given presumed immunity for other acts that are not explicitly defined as part of the presidential roster of things that a president can do in the Constitution. So what that did is that it set up the idea that a president, in this case, President Donald Trump, because there was a kind of a caveat, a warning in that decision that said, because we don't know what official acts are, the Supreme Court is what's going to get to decide what official acts are. So a lot of people are like, well, why doesn't just President Joe Biden take that out for a spin? Well, first of all, because he wouldn't. But second of all, because the Supreme Court almost certainly would have slapped down anything Biden tried to do, because they had set this up for Trump with the idea that they were going to put a green stamp on anything that Trump wanted to do and not for anybody else. But what they said is that they needed to give a president the opportunity to take bold and unhesitating action to make unpopular decisions, which they argued, although no president had ever asked for immunity before or even conceived of having immunity. You certainly didn't see that from somebody like Richard Nixon. They said that the president needed that in order to do unpopular things, even though, as I say, nobody had ever asked for it or even presumed that they could get it before, but they did that. All right, so if you start from that premise, exactly a year ago today, I still remember sitting here shell-shocked because it was so contrary to everything that the United States has ever stood for. What has come from that? Well, first, what came from that was the fact that the Supreme Court delayed that decision as late as it possibly could. You probably don't remember all the gyrations that the different prosecutors went through to try and get the Supreme Court to put forward a decision on Trump's challenges to the cases against him in time for him actually to go to trial. But they kept delaying and kept delaying and kept delaying. And this decision that they handed down on the last day of court. They did the last possible time they could. So what that meant was that they essentially ran out the clock, meaning that Trump would not go to trial in the two federal criminal cases against him. One for retaining classified documents when he left the Oval Office. And there were 32 counts in that case of willfully retaining documents. And there were also some other charges as well that had that a grand jury had come forward with. But also that he would not go forward to trial on his attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. That would not happen before the 2024 election in which he was running. So what came from that was that Trump won the 2024 election. And as soon as he won the election, in part by cobbling together, as I said, all these different constituencies with promises that contradicted each other, what happened as soon as he took office, the minute that he took office, was he began to break the law. The very first thing that the Trump administration did when Trump took office was to do what is called impoundment. That is refusing to disperse the monies that Congress has appropriated for something that Congress thinks is important. Now, it's critically important to remember that our Constitution sets up the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate as the only body that can make laws. We elect them. They are our representatives, and they're the ones who make the laws for us. The president is charged with faithfully executing those laws. But what the Trump administration has argued is that if Trump doesn't like a law, he can simply not spend the money for it. And that is illegal constitutionally, but it is unconstitutional. But there's also a law that Congress passed when Nixon tried that during his term. And the Congress passed a law in 1974 called the Impoundment Control Act, which says, dude, you can't do it. That's illegal. That is explicitly illegal. Well, the Trump administration, pushed by the director of the Office of Management and Budget, a man named Russell Vought, who was a key architect of Project 2025, has said, we don't think it's unconstitutional and we don't think it's illegal, so we're going to go ahead and do it anyway. So as soon as Trump took office, he began to impound funds that Congress had appropriated to keep the country running, to do things like fund cancer research and to fund the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and to fund, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I love that one, to fund the different things that make our country go. And that's something that Trump has insisted from the beginning he doesn't have to do. So today you are seeing that play out, for example, in the fact that today Trump has said he will not, this being the last day of certain fiscal years a number of educational fiscal years, that he will not disperse, and I've got the number written down here and I'm not seeing it. I think it's $6 billion for educational grants that have already been granted and that people are counting on for the K through 12 schools going forward, that he's simply going to impound them, that he's not going to disperse them, despite the fact, again, that is unconstitutional and illegal. So you got from the very beginning the idea that this president was simply going to do whatever he wanted with this legal decision behind him. And you saw that as well in the Department of Government Efficiency, which was never really a legal agency as near as I could tell. And they were very careful to make it unclear who was in charge of the Department of Government Efficiency, even though Trump repeatedly referred to billionaire Elon Musk as the person in charge of it. In court, the administration maintained that there were different people who were in charge of it, that Musk was only an advisor, that there was somebody else who was in charge of it. And they've played this shell game, which has made it really, really difficult for people to figure out whom to charge with the kinds of illegal actions that the Department of Government Efficiency took. You've also seen the overturning or the ignorance of court orders about things like not sending the planes to El Salvador with migrants on them for a detention in a third country. Again, something a court order said you may not do, they did it anyway. And now we're in this mess of having these poor men in CICOT, the notorious terrorist prison in El Salvador, because they're already out of U.S. soil, and Trump and his people sort of doing, again, a shell game of, well, the president can do whatever he wants with foreign affairs. Now this is a foreign affair, and so you can't get your hands on these people. So from the very beginning of his administration, Trump made it clear he was going to construct a government that reflected the interests of the people who elected him. And that would be, of course, Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. It would be the people behind Project 2025, the Christian nationalists who are trying to impose Christianity on the country. And it would be those people who wanted to get rid of business regulation. So who are trying to tear down the US government because they don't want business regulation. So you've seen this mix of things since he took office. But you've also seen something else, and that is the destruction of the rule of law. Because the way that you have the rule of law in this country is for people like the Department of Justice to uphold the rule of law. And what Trump did as soon as he was put into office was to put his own cronies into crucial positions in the American government, including at the Department of Justice, where Attorney General Pam Bondi is using that position, as are a number of the U.S. attorneys, to attack Trump's political enemies and to go after his political enemies and to make it very clear that they are not going to pursue anything that Trump or his people do that is contrary to the rule of law. So again, here you've seen the different aspects of the Department of Justice going after Democratic politicians, for example, charging a Democratic politician in New Jersey, trying to go after Democratic politicians for one thing or another. And now today, President Donald Trump has suggested that he will arrest and deport the young man who was just elected the Democratic candidate for mayor of New York, saying that we don't need people like him here. He is a naturalized citizen. And Trump suggesting he will strip Mamdani's citizenship and send him out of the country. So all of that I am giving you as a setup for what has happened today in the United States of America. And that is the Senate passed that budget reconciliation bill that Trump has demanded. This is a really important touchstone moment for what is happening in this country under this administration. This is an enormously unpopular bill. It's very difficult to think of another measure in our history that deals exclusively, not exclusively, but with deals largely with economics that has ever been this unpopular. I came up with the 1890 tariff bill, the McKinley tariff bill, but quite literally, I cannot think of another economic-based bill. I can think of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and before that, the Compromise of 1850. Those were both enormously unpopular bills. But this one is theoretically economically based, and maybe there are other ones out there, but the only one that I can think of is the 1890 McKinley tariff that was this unpopular. This is crazy unpopular. People really, really, really hate this bill. And yet, it has passed both the House and the Senate. And that says, I think, a lot of things. First of all, the bill cuts taxes for the very wealthiest Americans quite significantly. It will dramatically move money upward from the poorest Americans to the richest Americans. In order partly to offset the cost of those tax cuts, it will dramatically slash the programs that poorer Americans rely on, things like Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. It will also hurt the United States' attempt to address our energy needs with something other than fossil fuels, and will almost certainly send energy prices skyrocketing and destabilize our energy markets. That combination of things is, again, enormously unpopular, and says, I think, the degree to which Trump and his cronies simply intend to create a world in which the rich people get everything. So why would both the House and the Senate pass it? Now, a certain number of people in the House especially are just MAGA Republicans. They want Trump to be a dictator. They want whatever he wants. They're Christian nationalists. They hate the libs, and they're willing to pass anything. But the fact it passed the Senate, when quite literally Tom Tillis, a Republican of North Carolina, has said he will not run for re-election based on this bill, says something about the pressure that a president who is unrestrained by the rule of law can bring to our lawmaking. That is, he threatened Tillis with a primary, that he was going to interfere in the choices of North Carolinians to choose their senator in order to make sure that whoever gets into that position will do what Trump wants. And Tillis, who is a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, finally said enough is enough, because I will not cut the kinds of programs that North Carolinians rely on in order to put more money in the pockets of people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. And the thing about those cuts that's important to remember is it doesn't just cut the benefits of people who rely on Medicaid. You need to remember that many of our nursing homes and hospitals depend on that money from Medicaid, and those tend to be concentrated in rural areas. So the analysts of this bill say that we're going to lose a lot of rural hospitals. Similarly, SNAP benefits don't simply benefit the people who rely on them. They benefit those markets, again, especially in rural areas that depend on SNAP benefits in order for them to survive. So there's going to be a huge ripple effect through especially rural America from the possible passage of this bill. I'm going to tell you more about that in just a second. But so actually, let me finish with that, and then I'll tell you what else is in this bill. And one of the things it was the reason I couldn't sleep last night. One of the reasons. So the bill has not yet passed Congress. The bill passed the House in one form, And the Senate said, no, 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 we don't like that form of it. So they wrote their own version of the bill. And they passed it today by a vote of 50-50, with J.D. Vance, the vice president, casting the deciding vote to make it 51-50. 3 Republicans voted no. And the Republicans who voted no were Rand Paul of Kentucky, who can't stand the huge deficit increase with this bill. The bill is expected to increase the national debt by $3.3 trillion, which is going to destabilize our financial system. Tom Tillis of North Carolina voted no, and so did Susan Collins of Maine. Now, that's really interesting because Lisa Murkowski of Alaska voted yes. And it certainly looks as if Murkowski and Collins split their votes so that Collins, who is facing a really uphill battle for re-election next year, could say, hey, I voted against this unpopular bill, while Murkowski, who has quite a safe seat in Alaska, voted for it, even though she hates it, so that they would give Collins a way to push back against those people who are thinking of running against her. So it passed the Senate. Now it goes back to the House. Now, one of the pieces, and that the House can either agree to what's in the Senate bill, or it can go to a committee of conference, which will hammer out the differences between the two bills. But Trump has been adamant that he wants this bill by July 4th. Why? Why is it so crucially important to have this bill by July 4th? Well, because our Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the the Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security, has blown through all of its money. They're about, let me see, the fiscal year ends on September 30th, and they've already run through their annual budget, which, by the way, is illegal. They're not supposed to do that. But one of the things that this bill does is it provides an enormous amount of money to border enforcement. So I actually pulled the numbers here. The bill as it passed the Senate provides more than 170 billion with a B extra dollars for immigration enforcement. Now, just remember that one of the things that Trump did today was he said he would not disperse, I do have the number here, $6 billion for public education. So we have the money for $170 billion for border enforcement, but not the money for $6 billion for education. Those numbers break down like this. The Senate bill will give more than $50 billion for Trump to build a wall on the border. That's more than 3 times what Trump spent on the wall in his first term, even though it didn't appear to do anything. It provides $45 billion for immigration detention facilities. That is 265% of what the annual budget of this year was. $45 billion for detention facilities and another almost $30 billion for ICE enforcement, which is 3 times its current budget. So what are we doing here? We are taking money from Medicaid and from SNAP and from all these programs that benefit the American people, and we are creating a nation that focuses on tax cuts for the rich and corporations and on what are camps and rounding up of undocumented immigrants. And I want to say a couple of things about that. The first is that we keep hearing from the Trump administration that it's going after criminals. And in fact, about 8% of the people they have arrested have criminal convictions. The rest do not. So that's 92% of people don't have criminal convictions. What they are doing is they are defining anybody who has broken an immigration law as a criminal, even though that's a misdemeanor, it's not a felony. But that's how they got around that language, which, by the way, before the election, I had it out with a MAGA Republican who said I was wrong. And here's a newsflash, I was right about that. But I just want to point out in this moment, because of this bill, that the idea that undocumented immigrants are criminals is a construction. It is a lens to look at the American economy that the Republicans have deliberately constructed. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that throughout our history, of agribusiness, which is going to be after about 1880, when the Great Plains and the West really come into play as big factory farms as opposed to family farms. The idea when the Republicans put in place things like the Homestead Act in 1862, for example, was they had this fantasy that Nebraska was going to be full of little family farms, the same way that Massachusetts was, and that this was going to support democracy and everybody was going to be able to feed themselves, and you were going to have all these little towns all over the American plains and the American West. But the reality was that until we got decent kinds of irrigation in those places, it really wasn't possible to farm that way. What did happen was we got irrigation we got irrigation in those places, but that's really expensive. Getting water was expensive. So from the beginning of farming in the plains and in the West, we had agribusiness. That's not what they called it at the time, but we always had very large farms, and those very large farms depended on migrant labor. It wasn't always racialized. In fact, if you think about the 1890s and into the 1900s, many of the people who worked in those fields were white migrant workers. That's going to change in the 20th century. But our agribusiness has always depended on migrant labor, on cheap migrant labor that comes in, plants a field, harvests a field, and gets out and goes somewhere else. That's just the way it has always been. So if we're going to change that, which is certainly possible to do, we can do anything we want. Americans are going to have to get used to the idea of paying significantly higher amounts for food. But so what happened? So the people who managed who did most of the migrant labor in the American West, most of it, not all of it, tended to be, because I'm not going to really talk about the Japanese and the migrant laborers who came from the West and from the oceans, but who came across the border to work in agribusiness, did so really quite freely until the 1930s. People just came across the border to the US from Latin American countries and went back after the harvests. Things moved very easily. Especially after the 1907, Japanese workers are discriminated against much more severely than they had been before. So fewer of them tend to come, but other migrants just come back and forth. And of course, when the Depression hits in the 30s and nobody's got any work, a lot of the migrants in that area turn against the Mexicans, especially have come across the border, as well as against people from Oklahoma. I remember the Okies and the Arkies from Arkansas, and they push them back across the border. But then World War II hits, and all of a sudden the government's like, crap, we need more workers again, especially agricultural workers. And the government starts a program called the Bracero Program in 1942. And from 1942 into 1964, the US government backed workers who would come from, especially from Mexico, into the US to perform migrant labor. But the idea was that those people would be protected because they would sort of be official, but employers pretty quickly also hired unofficial workers and treated everybody terribly. So the Bracero program breaks down for a number of reasons in 1964. Because of the treatment of the workers, because of the increased mechanization, and most especially because Congress takes a look at the old 1924 Immigration Act, which set quotas for countries and had no quotas for Latin America because that was essentially an open border, and said, we really got to change the way we are doing quotas for various countries because our system is so incredibly racist. Because there were, in 24, they set up quotas for different countries to be able to send people to the United States. And some countries that they didn't like had like 0 people, and other countries they did like had lots and lots of people. And they said, in this 1964 post-colonial period, we got to change that. When they changed that with what's known as the Hart-Celler Act, they put a cap on Latin American immigration for the first time. And what they did was they capped it at 20,000 people. Not specifically, they did that in a lot of countries, but that's what happened. 20,000 people were allowed across the border. But 50,000 people were the people that were required in the fields. So that made 30,000 people illegal. undocumented when they came across the field, when they came across the border. And what happened then was that Congress recognized that they'd created a real problem. So in 1986, they remember that they write a new bill and they give amnesty to the people who are already here. But at this, and they try to crack down on employers who are hiring undocumented labor, but they also begin to guard the border. They militarize the border. And when they militarize the border, that means that people who have undocumented people who have come over don't dare to go back because now they're going to have a problem coming back again. So instead of fixing the problem, it exacerbated the problem. What has happened since then is, first of all, that in part because of American agricultural practices, there's been and political practices, there was an explosion of violence in a number of countries in Latin America, and a number of people came from them seeking asylum in the United States, which is legal. It is legal to seek asylum in the United States. And then during the coronavirus pandemic and immediately after it, especially, a number of migrants from other countries who had landed in countries in South America were pushed out of those countries because their economies turned so bad so quickly. And the US economy under Joe Biden was booming. So a lot of them simply came to the US where we were desperate for workers. And so this is how we've gotten to the problem that we have, where we have undocumented immigrants who are in the United States without having the correct paperwork. They are not criminals. That idea that somehow MS-13 members are fighting to get into the US is this hellscape fantasy that MAGA Republicans have embraced. And the kicker here is that twice now, Congress has tried to pass laws that would reform this system so that the number of workers the US needs could be here legally. That happened first a number of years ago. And if you remember House Speaker John Boehner, it passed the Senate, but House Speaker John Boehner refused to take it up in the House because he wanted to keep the issue alive as a political issue. And it happened again when Joe Biden took office. The first bill he asked Congress to pass was one that would address the desperate need for more border enforcement, for more immigration judges, and to get through the huge numbers of people that there was a backlog for in the US. And Congress wanted no part of it until finally the House of Representatives under Mike Johnson said they would not look at helping Ukraine fight back against Russia until somebody did something about the border. So when that happened, the senators there was a group of senators who worked all the way through Christmas to create this actually quite strong border bill that was mostly what the Republicans wanted. And it was all set to go through. And Donald Trump said to the Republicans, don't pass it because I want this issue to run on in 2024. They didn't pass it. And here we are. All right. The whole reason I set that up, that long history, was because the other thing that happened today, in addition to the bill that extraordinarily puts more and more funding into detention and interception of undocumented immigrants by people who at least are said to be ICE agents. Their faces are covered and they are not wearing any badges. So I remain a skeptic until I know more about it. The other thing that happened was the president went to Florida to visit the newly operative detention center in the Everglades. And people are using this cutesy little name called Alligator Alcatraz. And it is a detention center that consists of cages in tents for undocumented migrants who are caught in this system that we have created. And Trump and a number of the people around him, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, seem to think it's kind of a joke to put people in a swamp in Florida during hurricane season, surrounded by alligators and pythons. And Tommy Tuberville, a senator from Alabama, talked about migrants in the cities as rats the other day. And if you can't look at that and see the dehumanization that leads to tragedy, then you're not looking. And that worries me, not only in the short term for our neighbors who will be sent to these detention facilities. And of course, now, if this bill passes, we are funding even more detention facilities to the tune of billions of dollars. But to go back to where I started, the idea of a president who is above the law, what we are seeing is the construction not just of a fantasy of one man, because Trump is not mentally healthy. He lost it again today. He's not going to be here forever. He's just not. 79 years old, mentally, mentally losing it. You know, my grandchildren are not going to be dealing with Donald Trump, but my grandchildren are going to be dealing with the world that this administration is leaving behind. And the construction of these facilities, the ICE agents who are pulling people out of their cars and out of their homes for the crime of being caught in a labor system beyond their control that our Congress has refused to fix because the Republicans like being able to accuse migrants of being bad influences on the US so that they can turn out their white nationalist supporters. The construction of that system, once it is here, will be very difficult to get rid of. And once we get rid of the undocumented migrants in our midst, which, by the way, is already wreaking havoc on the construction industry and the food industry and so many things, it seems to me significant that Trump talked today about deporting, stripping citizenship from, or otherwise getting rid of the citizens in our midst who are speaking out against the Trump administration. This has all happened in a year. So where are we? We're in a really scary place, but there are a bunch of things I want to add to this today. The first is I'm seeing a lot of people, especially people who have given up chemical addictions, saying, I need a drink, I want a drink, it's not worth it, whatever. Do not give in to those people who are trying to control your life. If sobriety is important to you, don't give in to this. I'm trying to put some starch in your spines to stay with it and help your friends who are trying to stay sober because they're frightened and they don't know what to do in this moment. But two, these measures are extraordinarily unpopular. People hate these things. They hate moving money upward to the 0.1%. They hate that wedding in Venice. They hate the idea of cutting Medicaid and of cutting SNAP benefits and of cutting all those services that we care about. They want to add more money. People want to add more money to Medicaid and more money to education. We want to create a nation that works for all of us. And Americans really hate what is happening to our undocumented neighbors. You keep hearing that Trump is popular on immigration. Not when you drill down into the numbers. Americans do not like what ICE is doing. They do not like these camps. They do not like any of those things. But we are going to have to stand together to stand against this in this moment, because I think what we just saw with the Senate is really how terrified those senators are of Donald Trump and the people around him. And it's going to be important to make them realize they should be far more frightened of our votes than they are of MAGA Republicans' votes. And the fact that a young man in New York, Mamdani, was able to turn out so many young voters for a progressive program is really important, because that's going to say to people, hey, I can count on those people to stand up for me if I say I want higher taxes. So it's going to be really, really important to speak up. So what can you do in this moment? Continue to act locally, continue to act at the state level, continue to call members of the House especially, but also of the Senate, and continue always to speak up on social media, do videos where a bunch of us are talking about different things that we can do simply to spread the word, because those of us who know what's in that bill hate it. Very few people like it, even very few Republicans like it. But lots of Americans don't know what's in it because they're not paying any attention. And you have friends like that. I have friends like that. And we can call them out and make sure that they know what's in it, because it's only been a year since Trump got that free pass. And I'm just going to make the statement right here that one of the very first things that is going to have to happen for us to take this country back is for us to recognize that no one in this country is above the law, including and especially the President of the United States. Now, today is July 1st. I will speak to you again on July 3rd, but let's not forget that July 4th is the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, in which our founders rejected the very concept of kings and insisted that we are all created equal and that our government is not legitimate unless it commands the consent of those of us who live under it. Anyway, we can do this, but we simply are going to have to recognize what is in front of us. We have the numbers by far. This is, any numbers you look at, this administration is historically unpopular, but we are going to have to use our voices to make sure that people understand how unpopular it is, and to make sure that lawmakers will listen to us. I will see you on Thursday again. And until then, as I say, those of you who are in sobriety, keep the faith and keep steady. And the rest of us are just going to have to muddle through and see what we can all do together. Thank you for being here.